September 12, 1943. Camp Monticello, Arkansas. Capitano Aldo Farini of the Italian 132nd Armored Division had been a prisoner of the United States Army for 4 months. He had expected a cage. He had expected deprivation, surveillance, hostility. The specific adversarial management that a captured enemy soldier calculates as his reasonable expectation when the shooting stops. He had not expected the foreman of the Henderson cotton farm to hand him a hoe, point at a field, and walk away without posting a guard. He had not expected to be paid 80 cents per day for the work. He had not expected that on Friday evenings, with a pass issued by the camp commandant, he could walk 3 miles to the town of Monticello, buy a beer at a counter that served him without hesitation, and walk back before lights out with no escort, no watcher, no requirement beyond his own word that he would return. He always returned. Not because escape was impossible, the terrain would have supported it, but because the calculation did not favor it. Something about being treated as a man with a word to keep made, keeping it the obvious choice. 4,000 miles away, in a different compound on a different continent, German intelligence officers were studying the Italian prisoner program with an intensity that had nothing to do with rescue planning and everything to do with what it revealed about the Americans they were fighting. The differentiated treatment of Italian and German prisoners of war in the United States between 1943 and 1945 was one of the most consequential and least examined policy decisions of the American War Administration. It was not accidental. It was the product of a specific strategic calculation executed by the War Department's Prisoner of War Division under Brigadier General Blackshear Bryan, whose 1943 policy framework divided the Axis prisoner population into 3 operational categories: enemies requiring maximum security, enemies whose allegiance was conditional and potentially recoverable, and enemies whose commitment to their ideology was terminal and whose management required a different calculus entirely. The categories were not arbitrary. They were based on a genuine assessment of why different national populations had gone to war, and how firmly that commitment was held at the individual soldier level. The assessment identified Italian prisoners, most of whom had been conscripted into a war that significant portions of the Italian population had opposed from its beginning, as belonging to the second category. German prisoners, shaped by a decade of National Socialist ideological training and professional military culture that had fused Wehrmacht identity with Nazi identity in ways the Americans found genuinely difficult to separate, were assigned to the first. Japanese prisoners were assigned to a category that the policy framework addressed differently still, shaped by assumptions that mixed accurate intelligence with racial prejudice in proportions that the program's architects were not well positioned to separate. The result was a laboratory, and German intelligence, by the spring of 1944, was reading the results. Oberstleutnant Klaus Bergman, intelligence analyst for the German Prisoner of War Liaison Office in Switzerland, a position that operated through the International Red Cross as a conduit for information about German nationals in Allied custody, had been compiling assessments of American prisoner management since the first substantial German prisoner intake in North Africa in 1943. His analysis was thorough, his sources were multiple, and by March 1944, he had developed a framework for understanding American prisoner policy that contained one element he could not resolve into the rest of the structure: the Italian program. The Americans had taken approximately 51,000 Italian prisoners by early 1944. A substantial portion of them were working on American farms under minimal supervision, housed in conditions that exceeded the Geneva Convention minimum by a measurable margin, allowed recreational access to American communities, and offered, for those who signed a specific declaration, the status of Italian service units, in which they wore modified American uniforms, performed voluntary labor alongside American soldiers, and were, in the operational language of the program, no longer treated as enemies at all. Bergman's problem was not moral. He was an analyst. His problem was predictive. The Italian program was producing a recidivism rate the percentage of Italian prisoners who escaped, refused orders, or were disciplined for resistance of less than 2%. The German prisoner recidivism rate in comparable facilities was 23%. The gap was not explainable by the difference in security infrastructure, because the Italian program deliberately reduced security infrastructure as a design feature. It was not explainable by the difference in escape opportunity, because Italian prisoners in rural Arkansas and Texas had more escape opportunity than German prisoners in more secure facilities. The gap was explainable by only one thing, and it was the thing that Bergman's framework had no comfortable category for: the American calculation that trust, extended to men who had not been fighting for a cause they owned, would be honored by those men at a rate that made it operationally superior to coercion. He was right that this was the explanation. He could not file it as a conclusion, because the conclusion implied something about German prisoners that his superiors did not wish to examine. The Italian Service Unit program, formalized in August 1943 following Italy's armistice with the Allies, converted approximately 34,000 Italian prisoners into voluntary laborers who signed a declaration affirming that they would not bear arms against the Allies and would support the Allied war effort through non-combat work. The declaration required nothing more than a signature and a stated intention. It produced, in operational terms, a workforce that maintained its own discipline, required minimal American supervisory personnel, completed assigned tasks at a rate that American farm and construction managers consistently documented as exceeding what comparable American labor pools produced, and generated a total escape incident count across all Italian service unit postings in the continental United States between August 1943 and September 1945 of 61 escapes from 34,000 men over 2 years. The math was not complicated. It was, to Bergman's analytical eye, devastating. What the program had discovered, not through ideology but through operational observation, was that prisoners who had been fighting for a government they had not chosen, under officers they had not elected, for a cause that significant portions of their families opposed, were not, at the individual level, committed enemies. They were conscripts who had done their military duty and, when that duty ended at the point of capture, had no particular investment in continuing to perform it. Treating them as if this were true produced behavior consistent with its being true. Treating them as irredeemable enemies, as the German program did with its prisoner population, produced behavior consistent with that treatment. The Americans had not invented this principle. They had simply applied it with a consistency that made its effects measurable. Farini, the Capitano from Camp Monticello, signed his Italian Service Unit declaration on November 3, 1943. He was assigned to a construction detail at a military installation outside Little Rock, Arkansas, where he worked alongside American civilian contractors for 14 months. His foreman, a man named Douglas Pruitt, later told the Arkansas Democrat newspaper in a 1947 interview that Farini was the best concrete finisher I ever worked with, military or civilian, and that he had never once had cause to question whether the Italian captain would be where he was supposed to be at the time he was supposed to be there. Pruitt said this as a compliment. What he was describing was the operational outcome of a policy decision made in Washington in 1943 that had correctly identified the difference between an enemy who needs to be contained and an ally who needs to be recognized. What Bergman could not say in his analysis, but what his numbers implied, was that the German prisoner population contained individuals for whom the same distinction might apply: men who had been conscripted, who had served because refusal was lethal, who carried their Wehrmacht identity the way Farini had carried his Italian uniform, as a professional obligation that ended at the moment of surrender. The German program's design did not allow for this possibility. It treated all German prisoners as committed National Socialists until demonstrated otherwise, which meant it treated the men who were not committed National Socialists, and there were thousands of them, in a manner that made them perform as if they were. The self-fulfilling assessment was Bergman's blind spot. He could see it in the Italian data. He could not apply it to his own population without dismantling the premise of his own office. June 8, 1944. 2 days after D-Day. Camp Alva, Oklahoma. The camp held German prisoners classified as committed National Socialists, the hardcore file, in American administrative language, and its internal dynamics were the most violent of any German prisoner facility in the continental United States. 3 prisoners had been killed by fellow prisoners since January, all suspected of expressing anti-Nazi sentiments. The camp's internal governance was run by a prisoner committee that enforced ideological conformity with a precision that the American guards, prohibited by Geneva Convention from interfering in prisoner internal organization, could observe but not interrupt. Camp Alva was, in the specific operational sense, a German institution operating inside an American one. Bergman received a summary of Camp Alva's internal incident record in July 1944 through his Red Cross channel. He read it alongside his most recent Italian service unit compliance data. The contrast was not subtle. Camp Alva's incident rate, violence, disciplinary actions, escape attempts, organized resistance was 14 times higher than the comparable rate at Italian service unit postings with equivalent prisoner populations. The American security expenditure at Camp Alva, measured in guard personnel per prisoner, was 6 times higher than at Italian facilities. The productive output of Camp Alva's prisoner labor assignments was 40% of the Italian rate. A facility that treated its prisoners as irredeemable enemies produced irredeemable enemy behavior. The policy had created its own validation, at enormous cost, in the specific way that policies built on unexamined premises always do. Bergman filed a restricted assessment in August 1944, recommending that the German prisoner program examine the Italian model for applicable elements. The assessment was reviewed by his superior, General Major Ernst Lehr, who returned it with a single annotation in the margin, politisch nicht möglich. Politically impossible. It was an honest annotation. Lehr understood the assessment. He also understood that acknowledging the Italian model's superiority required acknowledging that the premise of German prisoner management, that all Wehrmacht soldiers were committed to a cause that made their recovery impossible, was not a military assessment. It was a political one. And political assessments in the German war administration of 1944 were not revised on the basis of operational evidence. They were maintained until the structure that required them collapsed. The structure collapsed on May 8, 1945. By then, Farini had been home in Verona for 7 months, having been repatriated under the Italian Service Unit Program's demobilization schedule in October 1944. Douglas Pruitt had already written his recommendation letter to the Arkansas construction firm that hired Farini's cousin as a foreman in 1948. The operational relationship had outlasted the war that produced it. That almost never happens. It happened because someone in Washington in 1943 had looked at 51,000 Italian prisoners and asked the correct question: what do these men actually want, and what does it cost us to give it to them? The answer was 80 cents a day and a pass on Friday evenings. The return was 34,000 men who kept their word. The documented operational record of the Italian Service Unit Program is specific and consistent. Of the 34,000 Italian prisoners who signed declarations and entered the program, 61 escaped, a rate of 0.18% over 2 years of operation. 0 were involved in sabotage incidents at their assigned facilities. 16 were disciplined for work refusals, all in the program's first 3 months before administrative procedures for handling disputes were established. The program's labor output, measured by the War Manpower Commission in a 1945 assessment, contributed an estimated 1.2 million man-days of productive work to American agricultural and construction projects during the period of peak American labor shortage in 1943 and 1944. The program cost the War Department $14.3 million in administration and facility expenses. American farm economists estimated that the labor it replaced would have cost between $38 million and $52 million at prevailing wartime wage rates. It was, in the cold arithmetic of wartime resource management, one of the most cost-effective programs the War Department operated. The German program's comparative record requires no extended analysis. Its recidivism rate remained above 20% throughout the war. Its guard-to-prisoner ratio remained at levels that consumed American military police personnel at a rate the War Department's 1945 post-war review characterized as operationally unsustainable at scale. The Camp Alva model, maximum security, ideological containment, adversarial management, cost more, produced less, and generated 3 prisoner deaths that required investigations consuming resources the program did not have. Bergman's post-war testimony, given to American military historians in Frankfurt in 1947, was precise and unsparing about his own analytical failure. He said, "I identified the correct conclusion in the Italian data in 1944. I did not apply it to the German program because applying it required admitting that the German program was built on a false premise about German soldiers. Some of them were exactly what the premise said they were. Many of them were not. I knew this. I did not write it. I was afraid of what happened to analysts who wrote things the command did not wish to read." He paused. Then he added, "The cost of not writing it was paid in guard personnel and escape incidents and 3 dead men in Oklahoma. I think about those 3 men. Here is the counterintuitive truth that Brigadier General Bryan's 1943 policy framework encoded, and that the Italian program's operational record confirmed. The most efficient form of prisoner management is not the most secure one. It is the most accurate one, the one that correctly identifies what prisoners actually believe, what they actually want, and what they will actually do when given a specific set of conditions, rather than the one that treats all prisoners as the worst-case version of their category." The American differentiation between Italian and German prisoners was not compassion dressed as policy. It was accurate assessment dressed as compassion. Bryan's team had done the analytical work to distinguish the conscript from the committed, the soldier from the ideologue, the man whose war had ended at the moment of surrender from the man who would continue it behind the wire. The Italian prisoners were the first group. Many German prisoners were also the first group. The program design recognized this for Italians and declined to recognize it for Germans, for reasons that were political rather than operational. And the operational record documented the cost of that declination in numbers that no one in the German prisoner administration found comfortable to read. The lesson extends far beyond prisoner management. Any institution that manages its least cooperative members by treating all of them as maximally uncooperative produces, in the cooperative ones, the behavior it feared. The farm in Henderson, Arkansas, where Farini worked without a guard, was not a security risk. It was a proof of concept. Treat a man as a man who will keep his word, and you have given him something to keep. That is the entire program. That is the entire principle. The Americans found it in a cotton field in 1943. The word, given freely, is kept more reliably than the man, kept by force.